Well, good day, everyone. Today is the first of a series of 4 that I'll be preaching through Ruth, just to give Andrew a little bit of a break while he's off a bit crook. But when we look at this whole story of Ruth, it's probably one of the favourite ones. A lot of people know the book of Ruth. And I think it's because it's about ordinary people facing ordinary things in their life, and when God acts, it's in an ordinary way. That is, he works through the decisions we make, he works through the circumstances of our life to bring about his purposes. And I trust that as we work through this short book, we will gain more of an understanding of our sovereign God and grow in love and in our appreciation, not for just what he's done, but for who he is. Sometimes it's a bit hard to see how some Old Testament books fit into the scheme of things, but when Paul was writing to Timothy, he basically said, the book of Ruth is God-breathed and is useful for teaching, rebuking, correcting and training in righteousness, so that we may be thoroughly equipped for every good work. The events of the book are set during the time of the Judges. There's a bit of uncertainty as to exactly where, but that was a period of about 250 years. The whole time of the Judges was a time of turmoil and chaos, a time of apostasy, a time when again and again God's deliverance was seen and yet God's judgment was seen, sort of in a cycle. There was a lack of the knowledge of who God was. It sounds pretty much like today in many ways. Yet this period was not all doom and gloom. If you have a look at the book of Hebrews, particularly in chapter 11, you'll find that he says he has run out of time to tell about some of the people who lived in this period. He does name Gideon, Barak, Samson and Jephthah. These were men of faith who served God to the best of their ability with the knowledge that they had. The book of Ruth is a book about the providence of God. God acting and being involved in the lives of his people on a day-to-day basis, guiding and directing, and often it's done behind the scenes. And you might only be, when you look back through your life, you'll see, so that's how God worked it out. And that's maybe the only time you see that God's in the situation. You might not see him in the situation at the moment. Looking at the first 5 verses of chapter 1, names, and this was given to him when God told him that this is what he would be, the father of many nations. The name Jesus or Joshua means saviour, because that is what he is. And in this narrative, names are also significant. Elimelech means God is king. The town of Bethlehem means the house of bread. Naomi means pleasant. The names of Mahlon and Chilion have various meanings depending on which commentary you look at, and some are completely opposite to the other, so we won't go there with those two. But as I said before, this whole period of time in the Judges was a time of chaos. And in the time of this narrative, there was a famine. Now, it may have been part of God's judgment on the people. It may have been an event that just happened. But the fact that Bethlehem, the house of bread, was affected may indicate its severity. It was severe enough to prompt Elimelech to take the drastic step of leaving his friends, neighbours and relatives, a whole uprooting of his family, and go to this land of Moab. These were a people who worshipped the god Chemosh, to whom human sacrifices were offered. They were also the people who had Israel in servitude for 18 years at some point during this time of the Judges. And it seems strange that this man, whose name was "My God is King," is not trusting his king to provide for his family. But before we judge Elimelech too harshly, aren't we often the same? Aren't there times when we doubt God's ability to provide for us, despite him saying that he will never leave us nor forsake us? Apparently there was no mass exodus from Bethlehem. It seems that most stayed, but Elimelech decided to take his family to what he thought was the security of knowing they had food. In other words, he went to Moab to save the lives of his family. But what happened? All three men died, leaving Naomi as a widow in a foreign land and 2 Moabite daughters-in-law. If we stay focused on the human side of this story, we see that move as a big mistake. Far from providing for his family, Elimelech brought insecurity and death. He died, his sons died, but worse still, there were no heirs to carry on the name of the family. And in Israel, there was no greater tragedy than for a family to cease to exist. Really, looking in hindsight, we can say that Elimelech would have been far better off staying in Bethlehem under God's judgment of famine than going to live amongst a people who were really the enemies of God's people. But let's look at the big picture. We see God working behind the scenes to accomplish his purpose to bring a Gentile woman to faith in the God of Israel and placing her in the lineage of his Son, Jesus Christ. The story of Ruth is the story of a God who is not frustrated by the mistake of one of his people or the poor quality of the material with which he has to work. And, well, just look at us all. Now, if we had to work purposes in life, would we choose us? But he is a God who is well known for turning tragedy to triumph. Remember Joseph, sold into slavery, but used by God to feed his family. God continues to work out the details of his plan, even in the worst of times. And because we're all human, I hope we are, we make a lot of mistakes, some bigger than others. And we will make mistakes. But because we are God's people, he will not cast us off as useless. He has a plan for your life and for mine that will be carried through. And Paul tells the Philippians that God began a good work in them and he will carry it through to completion. He won't leave it half finished. He will carry it through a new commission. Yet in the story of Ruth, we cannot overlook the fact that Elimelech died in a foreign land and did not see the resulting blessing which came from God's hand to his wife Naomi. Now in verses 6 to 18, Naomi hears a rumour that the famine's finished, that there's food in Bethlehem, because the Lord has come to the aid of his people by providing food for them. God had not forgotten his people. God has not forgotten Naomi. He prompted someone to tell her that God had ended the famine. God is involved in the lives of his people. What went through her mind? Can I go back? I sort of nicked out from there, and will they accept me back? I made a mistake. What about Orpah and Ruth? Will they accept them? They're Moabites. These are the sort of questions which go through the mind of someone who may have left this group of God's people because of hardship or because of persecution. You may have been in a similar situation when for whatever reason you've nicked off and then you come back. Will they accept me? Will they funnily at me? Will I have to sit by myself? So looking at Naomi, when they hear that God is comforting his people, or when God prompts them to return, there's a hunger awakened in them. But can they come back? Those who didn't left, who had to put up with the famine, what'll they say? People who face the same sort of thing with us, will you accept them back? If people have nicked off and gone somewhere else and find that they really want to come back. If they bring friends whose dress code is a little bit different, how will you treat them? Naomi came back to her people with two from a different culture, a different nation, a different language, probably different dress customs. Think of the prodigal son and how the father was constantly on the lookout for him, and then made a complete fool of an embarrassment of himself when he ran out to meet this son. Paul has some good advice for us in Galatians. He says, "Brothers, if someone is caught in a sin, you who are spiritual should restore him or her gently. But watch yourself, or you too may be tested." Anyway, Naomi made up her mind to go back home to the land of Judah. She effectively reversed the decision that she had taken with her husband just over 10 years before. She turned her back on Moab and the mistakes of the past and returned to the people of God. Ruth and Orpah were willing to go with her, despite being told to return home and get remarried and find security in that way. But Naomi recognises that the God of Israel's authority and mercy extends far beyond the geographical and national borders. It's only when Naomi tells her two daughters-in-law a few home truths in verses 11 to 13 about her being too old to provide any more husbands for these girls, that Orpah decides to leave and return to her home. Humanly speaking, I suppose Orpah did a sensible thing. She went back to what was familiar to her. She followed the wise advice of her mother-in-law and went back home. But Ruth, however, was more content to remain a daughter-in-law and care for her mother-in-law, Naomi. She wasn't interested, or she wasn't looking necessarily to get married again. But when we look closely at this, even in all this tragedy, there was something in Naomi's life which brought about a transformation in Ruth's life. She was prepared to turn to the God of Israel and accept whatever life had to offer for a foreigner in Israel. She was prepared to turn her back on her whole heritage and family in Moab. The religion she grew up with, she was prepared to abandon. And as evidence of her faith, she invokes the name of Yahweh rather than her former god Chemosh when declaring that she will stick by Naomi. Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May Yahweh deal with me, be it ever so severely, if anything but death separates you and me." Would we have made that same sort of statement? We look at these verses realising that Naomi cannot guarantee any sort of future for Ruth. She had nothing to look forward to in Israel. She was an outsider. She was a Moabite, of whom it was said that they may not enter the assembly of God even down to the 10th generation. And yet see the devotion in Ruth's words and what she said. Is this sort of devotion anything less than what we are required to give to our God? Before you answer, consider this. Paul, when writing to the Ephesians in chapter 2, he gives a picture of our situation which was very similar to Ruth's. Gentiles by birth, separate from Christ, excluded from the citizenship of Israel, foreigners to the covenants of promise, without hope, without God in the world. But God stepped in and made a way for Ruth by bringing her to trust in him. And God has also stepped into our lives. Paul goes on to write, "But now in Christ Jesus, you who were far away have been brought near through the blood of Christ." Verses 19 to 22. Well, they arrive at Bethlehem, and all the women came to ask in an amazed voice, "Can this be Naomi?" It would seem to me that the previous 10 years, with all the disappointment, with all the heartache, with all the grief, has taken its toll, and people just didn't recognise her. That may or may not be the case, but that's how I see it. 10 years can make a big difference, plus all this mess of life. And in verse 20, it's as though she's saying, you can see the bitterness I've experienced, the famine, the bereavements, the questionings, the partings, the hopelessness, but I know God as the Almighty, and I can leave the explanation or even the responsibility for this bitterness with him. And when you look at that, what she says, it's almost saying well, I'm bitter because it's God's fault. Naomi places the responsibility for her current situation in the hands of God. And 4 times she says that God did it. Who made me bitter? God did it. She's brutally honest about her feelings. Yet the name she uses is the Almighty. The fact that she uses that shows that she recognises that God is ultimately in control. And in calling him Lord or Yahweh, she acknowledges that he is also the covenant-keeping God of Israel. So yeah, she blamed God for it, but he recognised God's sovereign. So work out how you put those together. But we can learn our lesson from this too. How often do we become all super spiritual and keep our real feelings unexpressed, even to God? There are times when we feel like we want to tell him what we think of him in no uncertain terms. But we all become super spiritual. Oh, you're not allowed to do that. As if he doesn't know. Read some of the Psalms. They'll make your hair stand on end with what David wanted the Lord to do with his enemies. God is big enough to deal with what we want to say to him. If he wasn't able to handle it, then he's not worth being God. But I'll repeat it, God is big enough to deal with what we want to say to him. Naomi thought it was all God's fault, and she said so. She didn't pretend that everything was all right when it wasn't. Now, in these dark and chaotic days of the judges in which she lived, Naomi exhibits a faith and confidence in the God of Israel that is a bright light against this very dark backdrop. Her faith is open, it's honest, it is a faith that we can look at and copy, a trust that we can exercise in God, and Ruth's words of commitment to Naomi should be reflected in our lifelong commitment to our God. So what are some lessons that we can learn from this chapter? There's probably a lot, but I've sort of cut it down to 3. People are looking at us. They're watching us every day to see how we, as Christians, deal with the hard stuff in life. We need to have a faith that is both open and honest. We also need to have a lifelong commitment to our covenant God, which shows out in how we live each day, in telling of our disappointments, blaming God, but yes, trusting God. And thirdly, it's never too late to turn back from the mistakes of the past and return to God's people. So as we go through this week, let's keep those in mind.